Hey guys, tonight we're paddling gently into one of history's most unlikely obsessions. Ducks. Yes, those waddling, quacking, bread-hustling waterfowl. But tonight, they're not in a pond at your local park. Instead, you drift back over 1,000 years into the misty landscapes of ancient China, where scholars in billowing robes compose delicate verses to honor, romanticize, and occasionally existentially spiral about ducks. Picture moonlit gardens, ink-stained scrolls, and a bird that somehow became the muse of a civilization. You probably won't survive this, unless you've already made peace with the fact that some of the world's most celebrated minds spent decades debating whether a mandarin duck's coloring was more divine at dawn or dusk. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing that. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge quietly through a scholar's courtyard in the late Tang dynasty, the air thick with humidity and sandalwood incense. Crickets chirp in the bamboo thicket, and someone just recited a line about a duck so beautiful it made a man cry into his rice wine. You don't interrupt. You just drift closer. Ducks, particularly the mandarin kind, with their flashy orange sails and smug little faces, aren't just admired here. They're idolized. Ancient Chinese scholars believe the duck embodied both natural harmony and erotic idealism. That's a heavy load for a bird who spends 80% of its time preening and paddling, but no one asked the duck. It's just sitting there, existing, being metaphor-worthy. You watch as a man in a silken robe dips his brush into ink, head tilted. He's Li Bai. Yes, the Li Bai, the rock star poet of the Tang court who drank more than he wrote and still managed to immortalize both ducks and moonlight in ways your high school English teacher would weep over. In one ode, he praises ducks for their elegant partnership, calling them couples who never tire of each other, a notion he found enviable, considering his human relationships often ended in scandal or exile. And just like that, ducks became stand-ins for fidelity, tenderness, and the cosmic suffering of mortal love. You sit by a lotus pond, trying to find the duck that looks the most romantic, and realize they all kind of do. It's the eye makeup. But not every scholar wrote about ducks in soft focus. Some got weird. Take Bo Juyi, another Tang legend, who once compared a duck's movement on water to the effortless wisdom of a Zen master. "It floats," he wrote, "but it is not lazy. It moves without moving." Which sounds deep until you remember you just saw a duck chase its own reflection for 10 minutes straight. Here's your mainstream fact. During the Tang dynasty, poetry wasn't just art, it was currency. Success in imperial exams required mastery of verse. If you couldn't spin a haiku about autumn leaves and aquatic birds, you weren't getting that sweet government job. So naturally, ducks made their way into curriculum, coffeehouse debates, and love letters. The fringe bit? Some poetry circles treated ducks almost like religious symbols. A few eccentric Taoist scholars believed the mandarin duck's mirrored mating habits reflected the cosmic balance of yin and yang. And yes, there were actual duck-watching meetups, proto-birding clubs where men in robes stood by ponds and quietly judged each other's metaphors. Historians still argue whether the duck craze was genuinely spiritual or just a poetic fashion trend gone rogue. Were scholars truly moved by the feathered nobility of waterfowl, or were they subtly mocking court life under layers of flowery ambiguity? Either way, the ducks didn't complain. You walk past scrolls hung to dry, each one stained with black ink, wine droplets, and the faint scent of plum blossoms. In this world, every duck might be a mirror to your soul or a metaphor for the state bureaucracy. And you accept that. You sit. You watch. A duck dips its head beneath the water. Somewhere, a poet sighs, and another ode is born. You stretch your legs under a willow tree, your robes a little dusty from walking, and now you're firmly planted in the Song dynasty. Those scholarly centuries when things got even more duck forward. Here, beside a glimmering pond in a scholar's private garden, the water is still, the rocks are arranged with suspicious perfection, and the ducks? The ducks are thriving like overpaid philosophers on a sabbatical. During this period, poetry becomes more introspective, even neurotic. Scholars no longer just admire ducks for their beauty, they start projecting onto them. One such man, Su Shi, an exiled poet, statesman, and amateur chef, once likened a duck's plodding waddle to the weary gait of a man burdened with worldly failure. You sip your imaginary tea and nod. It checks out. Ducks become symbols of self-awareness, pathos, and occasionally low-key shade. One poem describes a duck staring at its reflection and sighing, as though it knew it was ridiculous. It's unclear if the poet was talking about the duck or himself. Honestly, it could go either way. You walk past a group of scholars laughing softly over wine. One of them recites a poem where ducks are described as little floating monks, blessed with calm, untouched by fame, yet constantly dunking their heads in dirty pond water. It's poetic hypocrisy, and it works. Everyone claps. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Song dynasty marked a golden age of art and literature, especially under emperors who were, themselves, deeply into calligraphy and painting. The imperial court sponsored art schools where students learned to paint and write about nature. That included a whole lot of duck ink paintings with delicate brushstrokes and accompanying verses that were either transcendent or just extremely committed bird fan fiction. Now here's the fringe tidbit. Some poets, most notably Mi Fu, were so obsessed with ducks and their aesthetic value that they incorporated duck motifs into their furniture design. Yes, someone genuinely crafted a low wooden table inspired by the curvature of a duck's neck. Another designed a scroll shelf meant to cradle knowledge as the duck cradles its mate. Let that one sit with you. You reach a stone bench beside a garden pond. The air smells faintly of osmanthus and damp moss. A scholar rests beside you, his hair pulled back in the traditional topknot, his face tired but amused. You know, he murmurs, ducks are like officials. They appear serene but paddle madly below the surface, hoping no one notices. You nod slowly. It's the first political metaphor involving poultry you've heard today, but not the last. Poetry from this period also starts to reflect on mortality, because what's better than watching a duck drift peacefully and thinking about your own inevitable demise? Poets begin to use ducks as symbols of fleeting glory. Their bright feathers fade, their partnerships end. They vanish into reeds like forgotten promises. Honestly, it's kind of brutal. In one haunting poem, a duck is seen floating in fog, its partner nowhere to be found. The poet compares it to the loneliness of widowers and the uncertainty of the afterlife. You glance around, and sure enough, a single duck glides by, ghost-like, as if on cue. You feel a little sad, and also slightly judged. Historians still debate whether these poems were coded critiques of the civil service system, or just the result of too much fermented rice wine and not enough vitamin D. Were these metaphors intended to bypass censorship? Or were song poets just big fans of melancholy waterbirds? Either way, the ducks keep gliding. They keep existing as blank slates for human feeling. And the scholars? They double down. You peek at a scroll being written. The poem begins, feathers of fire drifting through dusk. A duck dreams deeper than a man ever could. The line is beautiful, but the poet immediately crumples it and starts over. Apparently, it wasn't ethereal enough. You can't tell if this is devotion or madness, and neither can he. In this world, ducks are more than birds. They are reflections, criticisms, confidants. You begin to suspect that if you stare at a duck long enough, it will whisper your truth back at you. But all it does is quack, blink slowly, and paddle away, probably because someone tried to feed it pickled ginger. Still, you remain. There's something undeniably calming in the repetition, in the ripple of the water, in the brush of the wind. And if the ducks aren't impressed by your presence, well, that's on brand. You weren't here to impress them anyway. You wake, or maybe you never quite slept, as a paper lantern flickers above a narrow canal. We're in the late Ming now, sliding quietly into the Qing. And while ducks still float on ink-still ponds, something has shifted. The poems, once drenched in elegance and metaphysics, now come with a little side-eye. The scholars? They're tired. The ducks? Still floating. But now, maybe a little too clean, too arranged. You suspect someone's started using duck metaphors ironically. You stroll along a scholar's estate, ornate but over-decorated, like a period drama with too many costume changes. A man lounges beside a lacquered desk, ink brush in hand, gazing not at a real duck, but at a duck painting of a duck described by someone else's poem. Layers upon layers. It's duck inception, and no one seems to notice, or care. This is a time of Baroque complexity in Chinese literature. Poets still write about ducks, but they do so with an air of, we know this is ridiculous, but we're doing it anyway. One Qing scholar famously titled his poem, A Reflection on the Duck Who Refused to be a Metaphor. You almost choke on your imaginary tea. But here's your mainstream fact. By the Ming and Qing dynasties, classical Chinese poetry had become so formalized and rigid that entire manuals were written on how to construct the perfect regulated verse. You needed tone patterns, thematic resonance, and historical allusions, ideally all in under 20 lines. Ducks, with their long-standing cultural baggage, were an easy shorthand for nuance. Think of them as the emoji of ancient Chinese verse. One popular joke among mid-Qing scholars? If you don't know what to write about, write a duck. At least no one will argue with that. Which, of course, led to even more duck poems. Some serious, some spoofy, all slightly passive-aggressive. Now for your quirky tidbit, one overly ambitious bureaucrat poet actually commissioned a trained duck to walk across ink pads and then onto rice paper, claiming, "The duck shall write its own poem." People clapped. The duck bit someone. Art was declared complete. And you, sitting under a plum tree, realize the satire is starting to drip through. A poet nearby reads his latest, "Two ducks pass, one looks away. So too does fate avoid my face." He's 27 and already lamenting retirement. His friend nods solemnly and jots a reply about duck feet being cleaner than the government's tax system. The audience chuckles nervously. But among all this eyebrow-raising and feather-ruffling, there are still whispers of genuine emotion. You find a fragile scroll with faint ink stains, someone's farewell poem. A scholar leaving his post after decades of service writes, "May the duck who swims alone find peace in solitude." It's not flashy, but it lands like a sigh. Historians still argue whether these late dynasty duck poems mark cultural exhaustion or refined self-awareness. Was this a literature running on fumes, or an intentional slow burn into absurdist brilliance? Did they mock the duck, or finally become the duck? You're not sure. You just sit with the question. By now, ducks have survived revolutions, reforms, dynastic collapse, and about 1,200 poems. They've been called everything from sacred symbols to fat little diplomats. One Qing governor even issued a tax break for farmers who protected mandarin duck habitats, citing aesthetic continuity. You imagine filling out that form. In the waning years of Qing rule, as Western influences crept in and literary tastes shifted, duck poetry faded. Not because ducks stopped being poetic, but because people stopped having time to notice. Factories roared, wars brewed, the ponds dried. The ducks, ever dignified, just kept floating. You walk past a last gathering of poets, older now, quieter. They don't read aloud anymore. They just leave poems tucked under stones by the banks, for no one in particular. You find one, A ripple fades, a feather sinks, but still I watch, and still it blinks. No name, no date, just a quiet farewell to centuries of floating verse. You lean back, the imagined garden now soft around the edges. The lanterns dim. The ducks no longer glide. They rest, heads tucked beneath wings, water barely moving. The sounds fade into the distance, as if even the poets have grown still. In this quiet, you begin to understand. The duck was never just a duck. It was a mirror, for beauty, for love, for longing, for government frustrations, spiritual confusion, or simply the quiet ache of living too long with too many scrolls and not enough sleep. You breathe in. The pond reflects nothing now, just the pale moonlight, thin as a brushstroke. The trees whisper, not in words, but in rustling leaves and memory. Let your thoughts drift like those ancient verses, half remembered but full of feeling. Let the imagery soften into mist. Let the weight of poetic ducks, yes, even them, float away. You're safe. You're still. You're part of something timeless and slightly ridiculous. And isn't that just perfect? As you drift off, think of a duck, serene, unbothered, poetic in the way that only something completely oblivious to its symbolism can be. No more words now. Just water. Just quiet. Just you, floating slowly into sleep. Sweet dreams.